The Texas heat shimmered off the asphalt as George Strait's black SUV pulled into the familiar streets of Pearsall, the small town where it all began 50 years ago. At 72, George had seen every major venue in America, played for millions of fans, and earned every accolade country music had to offer. But today, driving through these dusty streets lined with modest houses and old oak trees, he felt like that uncertain 17-year-old boy again. "You sure about this, George?" asked Danny Richardson, his longtime manager and friend, glancing at him from the passenger seat. Danny had been with George for over 3 decades, managing not just his career, but becoming one of the few people who truly understood the man behind the legend. George adjusted his black cowboy hat and nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about this for months, Danny. Ever since we announced the farewell tour, there are things, people, I need to see before I hang up the hat for good." The SUV passed the old high school, its brick facade weathered but still standing proud against the afternoon sun. George's eyes lingered on the building where his life had taken its most crucial turn. Somewhere in those halls, in a small music room that probably hadn't changed much, Margaret Coleman had seen something in a broken, angry teenager that no one else had bothered to look for. "Mrs. Coleman," George whispered, the name carrying the weight of 5 decades. "I wonder if she even remembers." Danny pulled out his tablet, scrolling through the information their research team had gathered. "According to what we found, she's 89 now. Lives at Sunset Manor, about 10 miles from here. George, you know there's a chance she might not—" "I know," George interrupted gently. "But I have to try. She deserves to know what she did for me, what she did for all of us, who made it because someone believed in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves." They drove through the town center, past Martinez Family Restaurant where George had washed dishes after school, past Henderson's Hardware, where he'd bought his first guitar strings with money earned from odd jobs. The memories flooded back like a river breaking its banks. It was 1967 when everything had fallen apart. George's mother, Doris, had passed away from cancer that spring, leaving behind a devastated family. His father, John Byron Strait Sr., had retreated into his work and his grief, becoming a stranger to his own children. George, the middle child, had found himself adrift, his grades plummeting, his behavior becoming increasingly reckless. He remembered the day he'd been caught fighting behind the school gymnasium, his knuckles bloody, his shirt torn. Principal Wilson had been ready to suspend him, maybe even expel him. But then Margaret Coleman had appeared in the doorway of the principal's office, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her blue eyes sharp but kind. "Mr. Wilson," she had said in that firm but gentle voice that could command a room full of teenagers or comfort a crying child with equal effectiveness. "I'd like to speak with George, if you don't mind." George had expected another lecture, another adult telling him he was throwing his life away, disappointing his late mother's memory. Instead, Mrs. Coleman had led him to the music room, sat him down at an old, upright piano, and asked him a question that would change everything. "What does the pain sound like, George?" He had looked at her like she was crazy. Pain didn't have a sound. Pain was just pain. But she had waited, patient as a saint, until he finally mumbled something about feeling like he was drowning, like everything was too loud and too quiet at the same time. She had nodded, understanding lighting up her face, and placed a guitar in his hands. It was a beat-up acoustic Gibson, its finish worn smooth by countless student fingers. "Then let's give it a voice," she had said simply. Now, 50 years later, George sat in the parking lot of Sunset Manor, staring at the modest single-story building surrounded by well-maintained gardens. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the walking paths where elderly residents moved slowly with walkers and wheelchairs. "Want me to come in with you?" Danny asked, sensing George's hesitation. George shook his head. "This is something I need to do alone, Danny. But thank you." He paused, his hand on the door handle. You know, I've played for presidents, for crowds of 100,000 people. I've been on every major stage in America, but right now, walking into that building to see her, this feels like the most important performance of my life. Danny smiled knowingly. That's because it's not a performance, George. It's just you being grateful. George stepped out of the SUV, straightening his western shirt and adjusting his hat. The Texas wind carried the scent of mesquite and distant rain. As he walked toward the entrance of Sunset Manor, his boots clicking on the concrete walkway, he carried with him the weight of 5 decades of success, but more importantly, the memory of a teacher who had seen something worth saving in a broken 17-year-old boy. The automatic doors whispered open, and George Strait, the king of country music, stepped inside to find the woman who had made it all possible. The lobby of Sunset Manor was decorated in soft pastels, with comfortable chairs arranged around low tables laden with magazines and puzzle books. The afternoon light filtered through large windows, casting a warm glow over the residents who sat reading, playing cards, or simply watching the world outside. George approached the reception desk, where a young woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Sarah Mitchell looked up with surprise. "Mr. Strait?" she asked, clearly recognizing him despite his attempt to dress casually. We weren't expecting. Is there something I can help you with?" George smiled, the same genuine smile that had charmed audiences for decades. "I'm here to visit Margaret Coleman, if that's possible. I'm an old student of hers." Sarah's expression shifted, becoming more cautious. "Mrs. Coleman, well, she has good days and difficult days. Today..." She paused, consulting her computer screen. "Today has been challenging. She's been asking for her students all afternoon, but she gets confused about time. She thinks she's supposed to be teaching her music class." George's heart clenched. He had feared this possibility, had prepared himself for it, but hearing it confirmed still hit him like a physical blow. "Would it be all right if I saw her anyway? Even if she doesn't remember me, I'd like to thank her." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "She's in the activity room. We were trying music therapy with her earlier, and she seemed calmer there. But please don't be discouraged if she doesn't recognize you. The Alzheimer's, it's taken so much from her." George followed Sarah down a carpeted hallway lined with photographs of residents in their younger days. Some showed people in military uniforms, others in wedding dresses, still others in graduation caps and gowns. Lives fully lived, now compressed into wallet-sized memories on a wall. They stopped outside a room filled with the soft sound of a piano. Through the doorway, George could see an elderly woman sitting at an old upright piano, her fingers moving over the keys with muscle memory that transcended her failing mind. Her hair, now completely white, was still pulled back in the same neat style he remembered, though it was thinner now, more fragile. "Mrs. Coleman," Sarah called gently, "you have a visitor." Margaret looked up, her blue eyes still sharp despite the confusion that clouded them. She was frailer than George had imagined, her hands spotted with age, her shoulders slightly hunched. But when she smiled, he saw traces of the woman who had commanded respect and inspired love from generations of students. "Are you here for music class?" she asked, her voice still carrying that familiar authority tinged with warmth. "I'm afraid the other students are running late." "They're always running late, you know." George felt his throat tighten. He stepped into the room slowly, removing his hat. "Yes, ma'am, I'm here for music class." Something flickered in Margaret's eyes, a moment of recognition that was there and gone like lightning. She studied his face intently, her brow furrowing with concentration. "You look familiar. Do I know you? Are you one of my boys?" The phrase hit George like a sledgehammer. "One of my boys." That's what she had called her students, the ones who stayed after school for extra help, the ones who needed music more than music needed them. He had been one of her boys, one of the lost ones she had saved. "Yes, ma'am," George said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm one of your boys." He sat down beside her on the piano bench, the same type of bench where she had taught him his first chords, where she had listened patiently as he struggled to find his voice, both literally and figuratively. The piano was different, newer, better maintained, but his hands found the keys with the same hesitation he had felt 50 years ago. "What shall we play today?" Margaret asked, her confusion momentarily lifting as they fell into the familiar rhythm of teacher and student. "Do you remember your scales? Practice makes perfect, you know." George's fingers found the C major scale, the first thing she had taught him. As he played the simple progression, memories flooded back with startling clarity. It had been October of 1967, 2 months after the fight that had nearly gotten him expelled. Mrs. Coleman had convinced Principal Wilson to let her work with George instead of suspending him. 3 days a week after school, he would report to the music room instead of detention. At first he had resented it. Music was for soft kids, for dreamers who didn't understand how hard the world really was. He had wanted to learn to fight, to be tough enough that no one could hurt him again, the way losing his mother had hurt him. But Mrs. Coleman had been patient, relentless in her quiet way. "Music isn't about being soft, George," she had told him one day after he had slammed his hands on the piano keys in frustration. "Music is about being strong enough to feel everything and still create something beautiful from it. Your mother, God rest her soul, she wouldn't want you to stop feeling. She'd want you to learn to channel those feelings into something that could help others." She had been right, of course. As the weeks passed, George found himself looking forward to those after-school sessions. Mrs. Coleman didn't just teach him to play, she taught him to listen. She introduced him to Hank Williams and Bob Wills, to Lefty Frizzle and Ray Price. She showed him how pain could become poetry, how heartbreak could become harmony. But more than that, she had seen potential in him that no one else had bothered to look for. When he mentioned that he sometimes wrote down his thoughts in a notebook, she encouraged him to set them to music. When his voice cracked during a particularly emotional song, she assured him that authenticity was more valuable than perfection. "George," she had said one day in December, as snow began to fall outside the music room windows, "you have something special. I don't know if it's going to be music, but whatever it is, don't let anger steal it from you. Your mother wouldn't want that." It was the first time anyone had talked about his mother without tiptoeing around the subject. The first time someone had acknowledged that his anger came from love, not hate. That conversation had been the turning point. The moment when George began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could build something from the wreckage of his grief. Now sitting beside her 50 years later, George continued to play the simple scales, while Margaret nodded in approval. "Very good," she said. "You have good hands, patient hands. What's your name again, dear?" George hesitated, then decided on honesty. "George, ma'am, George Strait." The name seemed to echo in the air between them. For a moment, Margaret's expression cleared completely, and George saw a flash of the sharp, perceptive teacher he remembered. Her hand reached out and touched his, her aged fingers tracing the calluses left by decades of guitar playing. "George," she repeated slowly. "My George. The one who was so angry, so hurt. The one who found his voice." Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "You came back. I always wondered if you'd come back." George felt his own eyes burning. "Yes, ma'am. I came back." Margaret squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Tell me, my dear boy, did you make something beautiful from all that pain?" George looked at this woman who had saved his life, who had given him the tools to transform his grief into something that had touched millions of hearts, and he smiled through his tears. "I tried to, Mrs. Coleman. I really tried to." The recognition lasted only a few precious minutes before the fog of Alzheimer's rolled back in, leaving Margaret confused about where she was and why this stranger was sitting beside her at the piano. But in those minutes, George had seen something that broke his heart and filled it simultaneously. She remembered not just him, but what she had done for him. She remembered the scared, angry boy and the man he had become. A nurse, Patricia Williams, had entered the room during their conversation and now approached them carefully. She was a woman in her 50s, with the kind of steady presence that comes from years of caring for people during their most vulnerable moments. "Mrs. Coleman," Patricia said gently, "it's time for your afternoon medication." Margaret looked at George with confusion again, the moment of clarity having passed like smoke. "I'm sorry, young man, but I don't remember starting a lesson with you. Perhaps you should check with the office about your schedule." George stood slowly, his heart heavy but somehow fuller than when he had arrived. "Thank you for the lesson, Mrs. Coleman. It meant more to me than you'll ever know." As Patricia helped Margaret to her feet, George caught the nurse's eye. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped into the hallway, leaving Margaret in the care of another staff member. Patricia studied George with professional assessment and personal curiosity. "You really knew her, didn't you? When she recognized you, I saw something I haven't seen in months." She lit up. "She was my high school music teacher," George explained. She changed my life, saved it really." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I need to know about her situation, her care, her family, her finances, everything." Patricia glanced around the hallway, then motioned for George to follow her to a small office marked Patient Services. She closed the door behind them and sat down across from him at a modest desk covered with files and family photos. "I shouldn't be discussing this with you," she began, "but Mrs. Coleman talks about her students constantly. It's one of the few things that consistently brings her peace. She has no family left, never married, no children. She lived off her teacher's pension until about 3 months ago." George felt his stomach drop. What happened 3 months ago? The pension ran out. Social Security wasn't enough to cover the costs here, especially with her increasing medical needs. "We've been working with state assistance programs, but..." Patricia shrugged helplessly. "The reality is that she'll probably have to be moved to a state facility within the month. The care there isn't bad, but it's not. It's not what she deserves." George was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Margaret Coleman, who had spent 43 years teaching, who had shaped hundreds of young lives, who had saved him from a path that would have led nowhere good, was facing her final years in a state facility because she had devoted her life to children instead of accumulation. "What would it cost?" he asked suddenly. "I'm sorry? What would it cost to keep her here, to make sure she gets the best possible care for as long as she needs it?" Patricia looked at him strangely. "Mr. Strait, that's very kind of you to ask, but we're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her condition will only require more intensive care as time goes on and..." George held up his hand gently. "Patricia, what would it cost?" She opened a file folder and pulled out several documents, scanning them quickly. With her current level of care, including the specialized Alzheimer's program, the music therapy sessions, medication management, and accounting for the progression of her condition, we're probably looking at somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 for comprehensive care through the end stages of the disease. George nodded, as if she had quoted him the price of a cup of coffee. "And if we wanted to move her to the absolute best facility in the country, somewhere that specializes in Alzheimer's care with cutting-edge treatments and programs?" Patricia stared at him. "Mr. Strait, are you serious about this?" "Dead serious. Margaret Coleman gave me the foundation for everything I've accomplished in my life. She saw something in me when I couldn't see anything in myself. She taught me that pain could be transformed into something beautiful, something that could touch other people's lives. Do you know how many people have told me over the years that one of my songs helped them through a difficult time? Every single one of those moments exists because a teacher believed in a troubled kid 50 years ago. George pulled out his phone and dialed Danny's number. When his manager answered, George didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Danny, I need you to contact our legal team immediately. I want to set up a trust fund, something that will ensure ongoing care for someone very important to me. Then I need you to research the best Alzheimer's care facilities in the country. I want options. I want to know about experimental treatments, cutting-edge therapies, anything that might help." "George, what's going on? Is everything all right?" "Everything's perfect, Danny. For the first time in a long time, everything's exactly as it should be." George looked at Patricia, who was sitting in stunned silence. "I also need you to find the best geriatric specialists in Texas, people who can oversee a transfer and ensure continuity of care. Money is no object, none at all." After he hung up, Patricia finally found her voice. "Mr. Strait, this is incredibly generous, but Mrs. Coleman, in her condition, she won't understand what you're doing for her." George smiled, the same smile he had given her 50 years ago when she had first handed him that beat-up guitar. "That's okay, I understand, and sometimes that's enough." He stood up, preparing to leave, but turned back to Patricia. "I have one more request. I don't want her to know this came from me. I don't want any publicity, any recognition, any credit. As far as she's concerned, as far as anyone knows, this is just good fortune, an anonymous benefactor. Can you arrange that?" Patricia nodded slowly. "But why? Most people didn't have Margaret Coleman believe in them when they were 17 years old and ready to throw their life away," George interrupted gently. "She didn't help me because she wanted credit or recognition. She helped me because she saw a kid who needed help. That's what real teachers do. That's what real heroes do." As George walked back down the hallway toward the lobby, he passed the activity room, where Margaret was now sitting in a comfortable chair, holding a photograph and humming softly to herself. He paused in the doorway, watching her. She looked up and smiled at him, the polite smile she would give any visitor. "Have a lovely day, young man," she said sweetly. "You too, Mrs. Coleman," George replied. "You too." Outside, Danny was waiting by the SUV, his phone pressed to his ear, already making the calls that would transform Margaret Coleman's remaining years. As George approached, Danny covered the phone's mouthpiece. "The lawyers want to know how much we're talking about for this trust fund," Danny said. George looked back at the modest building that housed the woman who had saved his life, then at his friend and manager who had helped him build an empire. "Whatever it takes, Danny. Whatever it takes to give her the same gift she gave me." "Which was?" George climbed into the passenger seat and settled his hat on his knee. "Hope," he said simply. "She gave me hope when I had none. Now it's my turn." 2 weeks later, George was in Nashville, putting the finishing touches on what would be his final studio album, when Danny walked into the recording studio with an update that made him smile wider than he had in months. "The transfer went perfectly," Danny reported, settling into a chair in the control room while George took a break from laying down vocals. "Margaret is now a resident at the Brookdale Institute in Dallas. It's the premier Alzheimer's research and care facility in the Southwest. They have music therapy programs that are unlike anything I've ever seen." George removed his headphones and leaned back in his chair. Through the glass partition, his longtime producer, Tony Richardson, no relation to Danny, was reviewing the tracks they had recorded that morning. The songs on this album were more personal than anything George had ever recorded, influenced heavily by his recent reconnection with his past. "How is she adjusting?" George asked. "Better than expected. The transition team you hired, Patricia Williams, actually agreed to relocate to Dallas to continue as her primary care coordinator. Having a familiar face has made all the difference." Danny consulted his notes. Dr. Michelle Hawthorne, the facilities director, says Margaret has shown remarkable improvement since starting their specialized music therapy program. She's more alert, more engaged. George nodded, satisfied. The Brookdale Institute hadn't just been chosen for its reputation, it had been selected because of its innovative approach to Alzheimer's care. They used music as a pathway to locked memories, employing neurological research that suggested musical memories were often the last to fade. "There's something else," Danny continued, his expression shifting to something more complex. "Dr. Hawthorne wants to document Margaret's case as part of their research. Apparently, her response to the music therapy has been extraordinary. They think her lifetime of teaching music created neural pathways that are more resistant to the disease's progression." "That doesn't surprise me," George said. "She lived music. It wasn't just her profession, it was her calling." Tony Richardson stepped out of the control room, holding a notepad covered with his distinctive scrawl. Tony had produced George's biggest hits, understood his artistic vision better than almost anyone, and had become more friend than business associate over their 20-year collaboration. "George, I've been listening to the new tracks," Tony said, excitement evident in his voice. "There's something different about this album. The authenticity, the emotion, it's like you've tapped into something deeper than you've ever accessed before." George exchanged a look with Danny. They hadn't told Tony about Margaret, about the visit to Sunset Manor, about the profound impact that reconnection had made on George's current songwriting. But Tony was right. The songs George had been writing and recording over the past few weeks carried a weight, a truth, that even his most celebrated work had never quite achieved. "There's a story I need to tell you, Tony," George said, "about where these songs are coming from." Over the next hour, George recounted his visit to Margaret Coleman, the recognition that had flickered in her eyes, the heartbreaking reality of her condition, and his decision to ensure her remaining years would be filled with dignity and the best possible care. As he spoke, Tony's expression shifted from surprise to understanding to something approaching awe. "Jesus, George," Tony finally said. "Do you realize what you've done? Not just for her, but for yourself? These songs, they're your way of processing this full circle, aren't they?" George picked up his acoustic guitar, the same model Gibson he had learned to play on all those years ago in Margaret's music room. His fingers found the opening chords to a song he had written just the night before, lyrics that had poured out of him like water from a broken dam. "There's a teacher in a small-town school who saw beyond my teenage fool. She gave me hope when hope was gone, helped me find where I belong." He sang softly, the melody simple but haunting. 50 years have come and gone, but her lessons linger on. In every song I've ever sung, she's there in every note I've strung. Tony was quiet for a long moment after George finished. "That needs to be on the album," he said finally. "Hell, that needs to be the centerpiece of the album." But George shook his head. "No, this one's not for the public. This one's for her." "George, Tony, some things are too sacred to sell. This song, what it means, what she means, that's not for the world. That's between her and me." Danny leaned forward in his chair. "Actually, George, there might be another way to honor her. Something that could help other teachers, other students." George looked at his manager expectantly. "What if we established a foundation?" Danny suggested. "The Margaret Coleman Foundation for Music Education. We could provide instruments for schools that can't afford them, fund music therapy programs, offer scholarships for kids who want to study music but don't have the means." The idea hung in the air like a perfectly struck chord. George felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that this was exactly right, exactly what Margaret would have wanted. "She always said that music was meant to be shared," George said slowly. "That the gift of music wasn't really yours until you gave it away to someone else." Tony nodded enthusiastically. "And we could record that song you just played." not for commercial release, but as part of the Foundation's promotional materials. Let people understand what music education can do, how one teacher can change not just one life, but potentially thousands of lives through the ripple effect. George was quiet for several minutes, his fingers absently picking out melodies on the guitar. Finally, he looked up at his two closest professional collaborators, men who had become family over the decades of shared creative work. "There's something poetic about it," he said. "Margaret saved me with music. Now we get to save other kids with music in her name. But I have one condition." "Anything," Danny said immediately. "She can never know that any of this came from me. The care facility, the foundation, none of it. As far as she's concerned, as far as the world knows, these are just good things that happened. Anonymous benefactors, private donors, whatever story we need to tell." Tony frowned. "George, why hide your involvement? This is the kind of legacy story that—" "Because," George interrupted gently, "Margaret Coleman never taught me to seek recognition. She taught me to seek truth. She taught me that the best gifts are the ones given without expectation of return. She spent 43 years giving that gift to kids like me, never asking for fame or fortune or recognition. The least I can do is honor that example." Danny was already pulling out his phone. "I'll have the lawyers start drawing up the foundation paperwork immediately. How much do you want to seed it with?" George thought about Margaret, sitting in that activity room, her fingers finding familiar melodies on the piano keys, despite the fog in her mind. He thought about all the other teachers like her, all the other kids like he had been, all the potential that could be unlocked with just a little belief and a lot of music. "Start with 10 million, he said. "We'll grow it from there." Tony whistled low. $10 million. George, do you realize what kind of impact that could have? George smiled, remembering a 17-year-old boy with bloody knuckles and a broken heart, sitting at an old upright piano while a patient teacher showed him how to transform pain into something beautiful. "I hope it's a fraction of the impact one teacher had on one student 50 years ago, he said. "If we're that lucky, we'll change the world." 6 months later, George stood on the stage of the Alamodome in San Antonio, Texas, preparing for what he had announced would be his final concert. 50,000 fans filled every seat, their voices already hoarse from singing along to 5 decades of hits. But tonight felt different, not just because it was an ending, but because it was also a beginning. In the VIP section, Danny sat with Patricia Williams and Dr. Michelle Hawthorne from the Brookdale Institute. They had flown in with extraordinary news about Margaret Coleman's progress, news that George would hear after the show. For now, he was focused on giving his fans the farewell they deserved. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said into the microphone, his voice carrying the same authenticity that had made him a legend. "Before we close out tonight, I want to tell you about something that's been on my heart lately." The massive crowd quieted, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "There's a foundation that's been started recently, called the Margaret Coleman Foundation for Music Education. Now, you might not know who Margaret Coleman is, but I guarantee you that music education has touched every one of your lives in some way. Maybe it was a teacher who believed in you. Maybe it was a song that got you through a tough time. Maybe it was just the simple joy of singing along to the radio." George walked to the edge of the stage, closer to his audience. "This foundation is going to make sure that kids who might not otherwise have the chance get to experience the magic of music. We're going to put instruments in schools, fund programs, and help teachers who dedicate their lives to showing young people that they have something valuable inside them." The crowd erupted in applause, but George raised his hand for quiet. "Here's the thing, though. This isn't about me. This isn't about any one person. This is about the idea that when we invest in music education, when we believe in teachers and students, We create ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine. Somewhere out there tonight, there's a kid who thinks nobody cares about them, who thinks they don't have anything special to offer the world. Tomorrow, because of what we do today, a teacher is going to show that kid they're wrong. In her room at the Brookdale Institute, Margaret Coleman sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the news coverage of George's farewell concert on television. The facility had become like a family to her, and tonight, many of the staff and residents were gathered in the common room to watch the broadcast together. Margaret's condition had improved remarkably since her arrival at Brookdale. The combination of cutting-edge medical care, innovative music therapy, and the sense of purpose she felt participating in the research program had given her more good days than anyone had dared to hope for. She still had episodes of confusion, still struggled with short-term memory, but her long-term memories, especially those connected to music, remained surprisingly intact. "Mrs. Coleman," said Dr. Sarah Bennett, one of the music therapists who worked with Margaret daily, "are you enjoying the concert?" Margaret smiled, her attention focused on the man on the screen. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at memories just beyond her grasp. "He has kind eyes," she said, "and listen to his voice. You can hear the truth in it. That's what I always told my students. The audience can hear truth." On the television, George had moved to a simple stool at center stage, holding only his acoustic guitar. The elaborate stage production had been stripped away, leaving just a man and his instrument under a single spotlight. "This next song," George said to his audience, and to the millions watching on television, "is for every teacher who ever saw potential in a student when that student couldn't see it in themselves. It's for every person who chose to build someone up instead of tear them down. It's for the understanding that the greatest gift we can give each other is belief." He began to play, his fingers finding the familiar chords of a song no one in the audience had ever heard before, a song he had written but never recorded, never performed publicly until this moment. "There's a teacher in a small-town school who saw beyond my teenage fool. She gave me hope when hope was gone, helped me find where I belong. And though the years have come and gone, her lessons linger on, in every song I've ever sung. She's there in every note I've strung." In her chair at Brookdale, Margaret Coleman suddenly sat up straighter, her hand moving to her throat. The fog that so often clouded her mind seemed to lift, and she was 17 years old again, standing in front of her first music class, nervous and excited and determined to make a difference. She never knew the seeds she sowed would grow into this winding road that led me here to sing tonight for all the world to see her light. So here's to teachers everywhere who show young hearts how much they care. The song you helped me learn to sing will echo through eternity. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The melody was hauntingly familiar, and the words spoke to something deep in her soul, something that connected to her purpose, her calling, her life's work. "That's beautiful," she whispered to Dr. Bennett. "He understands. Whoever he is, he understands what it means to teach." Dr. Bennett exchanged a glance with Patricia Williams, who had moved to stand behind Margaret's chair. They both knew the truth about George Strait's connection to Margaret, about his anonymous generosity, about the foundation that bore her name. But they also knew that the gift was given in love, without expectation of recognition or gratitude. On the television, George finished the song to thunderous applause, but instead of acknowledging the crowd's reaction, he stood quietly for a moment, his head bowed, as if listening to something only he could hear. "You know," he said finally, his voice softer now, more conversational, "I've been blessed to make music for most of my life. I've had hits on the radio, awards on the shelf, and more good fortune than any one person deserves. But none of that means anything if we don't pass it forward. None of it matters if we don't use what we've been given to lift others up. He looked directly into the camera, and for a moment it seemed like he was speaking to someone specific, someone watching from far away. So tonight, as we close this chapter, I want to make a promise. The Margaret Coleman Foundation isn't just going to help students and teachers. It's going to make sure that the kind of person who spends their life believing in others, who gives everything they have to help kids find their voice, never has to worry about being forgotten or left behind. It's going to make sure that those who spend their lives caring for others are cared for in return. Margaret leaned forward in her chair, something stirring in the depths of her memory. The way he spoke about teachers, about caring for those who care for others, resonated with a truth she felt but couldn't quite grasp. "Patricia," she said suddenly, turning to the nurse who had become like a daughter to her. "What did he say that foundation was called?" "The Margaret Coleman Foundation for Music Education," Patricia replied gently. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her mind working to process this information. That's my name," she said slowly. Why would someone name something after me?" Dr. Bennett knelt beside Margaret's chair, taking her hands gently. "Because you've touched more lives than you realize, Mrs. Coleman. Because 43 years of teaching, of believing in students, of helping young people find their voices, that kind of impact doesn't just disappear. It ripples out into the world in ways we can't even imagine." On the television, George was preparing for his final song of the evening, but first he had one more announcement to make. "Before we close tonight, I want to share some incredible news about the foundation we just talked about. In just 6 months, we've already placed instruments in over 200 schools across Texas and the surrounding states. We've funded music therapy programs in 15 medical facilities. We've provided scholarships to more than 300 students who might not otherwise have had the chance to study music." The crowd erupted in applause, but George wasn't finished. "But here's the most important thing we've learned. When you invest in music education, when you support teachers who dedicate their lives to believing in young people, the return is immeasurable. We've received letters from students who found their confidence through music, from parents whose children discovered talents they never knew they had, from teachers who can now do what they've always dreamed of doing because they finally have the resources they need." George paused, his eyes seeming to look directly through the camera to a small facility in Dallas where an elderly woman was beginning to understand the magnitude of her life's impact. "Music education isn't just about creating musicians," he continued. "It's about creating human beings who understand that they have something valuable to contribute to the world. It's about teaching young people that their voices matter, that their stories are worth telling, that their pain can be transformed into something beautiful." Margaret's hand moved to her heart, and for the first time in months, her mind was crystal clear. She remembered a young man angry and hurt who had sat at her piano 50 years ago. She remembered teaching him that pain could be transformed into something beautiful. She remembered telling him that his voice mattered. "George," she whispered, the name coming from some deep place in her memory. "My George, the one who was so hurt, so angry, the one who found his voice." Patricia felt her own eyes fill with tears. "Yes, Mrs. Coleman, you're George." Margaret looked back at the television, where George was beginning his final song of the evening, "Amarillo Morning," one of his earliest hits. A song about new beginnings and the promise that tomorrow holds. As he sang, Margaret began to hum along, her voice soft but sure. The melody was familiar, comforting, and as she hummed, other residents in the common room began to join in. Soon, the entire room was filled with voices, people who had lived full lives, now sharing this moment of music together. Dr. Hawthorne, who had been documenting Margaret's progress throughout the evening, made notes about the clarity she was displaying, the emotional connection she was making to the music and the memories it awakened. This would become part of the research that would eventually help other Alzheimer's patients, another ripple in the endless pond of Margaret Coleman's influence. When the song ended and George took his final bow, Margaret continued to hum softly. The melody seemed to unlock something in her mind, and suddenly she was back in her classroom, surrounded by eager young faces, teaching them that music was the universal language of hope. "You know," she said to Patricia, her voice clear and strong, "I always told my students that a teacher's greatest reward isn't seeing their name in lights or hearing their songs on the radio. It's knowing that you've helped someone find their voice, that you've given them the tools they need to create something beautiful from whatever life brings them." She smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "I think I did that. I think I really did that." Patricia squeezed her hand. "Yes, Mrs. Coleman, you absolutely did that." Later that evening, after the residents had gone to bed and the facility had settled into its quiet, nighttime rhythm, Margaret sat in her room, looking out at the Dallas skyline. The city lights twinkled like stars, and she could almost hear music in their patterns. On her bedside table sat a letter that had arrived that afternoon, one of dozens that came to the facility each week since the foundation had been announced. This one was from a 15-year-old girl in rural Oklahoma whose school had received instruments through the Margaret Coleman Foundation. "Dear Mrs. Coleman," the letter read, "I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I wanted to thank you. My school got a new piano because of your foundation, and I've been learning to play. Music has helped me through some really tough times at home, and I think I want to be a music teacher someday, just like you. I want to help other kids the way your foundation helped me. I want to pass it on." Margaret held the letter in her hands, reading it again in the soft light from her bedside lamp. Even on her difficult days, when the Alzheimer's made everything seem foggy and uncertain, letters like this cut through the confusion with perfect clarity. She understood now, with the kind of deep knowing that transcends memory and logic, that her life had meant something. Every lesson she had taught, every student she had encouraged, every young person she had believed in when they couldn't believe in themselves, it had all mattered. It had all rippled out into the world in ways she never could have imagined. Somewhere in Texas, George Strait was probably on his bus, heading home after his final concert, carrying with him the satisfaction of a career well lived, and the knowledge that he had honored the woman who had made it all possible. He would never seek recognition for what he had done, never acknowledge publicly his role in the foundation that bore her name. But Margaret knew. In the way that matters most, in the deep places of the heart where truth lives, she knew. Her student had come home, her boy had remembered, and in remembering, he had ensured that her life's work would continue long after she was gone, rippling out into an endless future filled with young voices finding their songs. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Margaret Coleman smiled, her dreams filled with music and the faces of all the students she had taught, all the lives she had touched, all the songs yet to be sung by voices she had helped to find. The melody that had started in a small music room 50 years ago would play on forever, carried forward by grateful hearts and the understanding that the greatest gift we can give each other is the belief that we all have something beautiful to contribute to the world. The song, as Margaret had always known it would, had no ending. It simply passed from one voice to the next, growing richer and more beautiful with each person who learned to sing it. And in that way, Margaret Coleman, teacher, mentor, and believer in the power of music to transform lives, would live forever in the voices of all those she had helped to find their songs. In the quiet of her room, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a legacy that would endure, Margaret hummed softly to herself the melody of gratitude and grace, of second chances, and the extraordinary power of one person's belief in another. It was the most beautiful song of all, and it would play on, note by perfect note, for as long as there were teachers to believe and students to dream, and voices waiting to be found. The story of Margaret Coleman and George Strait was complete, but the song they had created together, a song of hope, of transformation, of the endless possibility that exists when someone believes in us, that song would never end.